Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Otten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Have you or any member of your family ever been diagnosed schizophrenic, mentally incompetent?
My uncle thought he was St. Jerome.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Otten, and I'm joined by Chad Gross. How are you keeping this week, Chad?
I'm doing well. I had a fun experience this week. I actually listened to an old Apologetics 315 throwback interview with Mr. Brian Otten, that's you, and philosopher Richard Swinburne. I had the pleasure of watching my daughter practice ice skating, but sometimes there's some chatty Cathys that sit around me and talk about things that I necessarily don't want to hear. And I thought to myself, I'm going to take my earbuds and I'm going to listen to a good interview. And for some reason, Mr. Swinburne came to mind. Hadn't heard anything of him, and I had recently posted a debate online, and it was very interesting, or on Truth Bomb, about him. So I pulled up your old interview, and man, it was really good. Some nuggets I took from it were, first of all, I love how he refers to one of the church fathers, St. Gregory, not St. Jerome. And he talks about how we should find out what someone takes for granted and then meet them there when we're talking to them about God. So, for example, most people take for granted that the universe is orderly, or most people take for granted that reason is reliable. Yeah. And his suggestion was to meet them there and then begin talking about, well, why is that? And I thought it was amazingly practical, but very helpful. And I also loved how he used Jesus and Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection to answer the problem of evil. I thought he did that in a very succinct, thoughtful way that didn't besmirch the problem of evil, if you will, or make light of it. And so I thought that was very helpful as well. I've also made a commitment, sir, I wanted to tell you about.
Okay.
I have decided that I am going to do a deep dive into eschatology. I have never done that before. And I notice as I'm reading through the Bible, there are a lot of references to the end times or the last days. And I don't have a good handle on what I think about that. I know that there are some things that I scratch my head about when I hear some people talk about the end times. But if you ask me what my view was, I don't know that I could tell you right now. I'm kind of sadly ignorant there. So I'm doing a deep dive into eschatology. I'm going to start with Ken Sample's book, his little book. It's only 80 pages called Christian Endgame. And it's a great introduction to the various views. So that's what's going on with me. How about you?
Cool. Well, it sounds great. Sounds great.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Remember how I said I was going to work through the Lennox and Gooding series? Well,
yes.
I finished it.
The whole series?
Yeah. So instead of treating podcasts with priority, I've been treating books with priority, but audioizing them, so to speak.
Right.
So I was scanning it with a great little app, which I'll link in the show notes, and then reading it with another app, which I'll link in the show notes. So yeah, it's been really helpful. Some books you got to go at a slower speed than others, but this was great. I really enjoyed that series. And so I'll link to that if anybody's interested in reading through those. That's been good. And thanks for mentioning that interview as well. I now it makes me want to go back and listen to it because I remember thinking when that was lined up, I'm like, wow. Richard Swinburne. Yeah, he said yes. I'm just grateful that I had an opportunity to speak to him. And I do remember just thinking, wow, that was really a great conversation. Great thinker.
Yeah. And if you could put that in the show notes, too.
Okay. Well, now I got a lot of work to do. So I'm not going to say anything else other than introduce our guest for today. But I spoke to him a couple years ago. He's a friend of mine he actually lived in Belfast for a while, but he's an American. He's kind of lived all over the globe. Christian Hubbs. He's one of the hosts of the Artificially Intelligent podcast. He's got a Master of Science from ETH Zurich. That's Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, Zurich.
I knew that.
Like, he could probably speak back 10 languages by now. But he's also got an MA in Christian apologetics from Biola. He's an AI researcher for a Fortune 50 company. all while completing his PhD in machine learning and optimization at Carnegie Mellon University. His podcast can be found at www.artificiallyintelligent.tech, which focuses on AI and economics, and a blog on the topic at datahubs.com with 2 B's. And he was also the Reasonable Faith chapter director in Zurich, Switzerland for 3 years. So he's got experience doing apologetics. And a couple years ago, I spoke to him about the practical uses of artificial intelligence, the current AI research, and how the Christian worldview informs our thinking about AI. So the follow-up interview is to see if Skynet is online yet, and if Mark Zuckerberg is a T-1000 Terminator or something terribly, terribly worse.
I've always wondered.
I'm interested in AI and how it relates to things like privacy, censorship, freedom, and how Christians can be informed about these subjects. So we'll see where the conversation goes. So let's stop talking about it and go to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Christian Hubbs, thanks for coming on the show again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
It's been a few years since our last talk, and now you've got a growing family. Tell us a little bit about where you're located, what sort of work you're doing, and what's happening with your family.
Yeah, I don't actually remember where I was living last time. So, I was in Belfast with you for a little while, and then I went off to Carnegie Mellon to work on my PhD, focused on, machine learning and optimization. Then I moved to Chicago for a bit, and now I'm in Houston. So a couple of different cities in between. So I don't know exactly where we were 2 years ago, 3 years ago at this point. But yeah, since then, things are well. Like I said, I'm in Houston now, and, we've got a little baby here. So it's always a pleasure and a little bit of joy there.
Cool. Well, we're interested in finding out a little bit about AI today, artificial intelligence, but what sort of work do you do on a day-to-day basis in that regard?
Yeah, so I work for a large, Fortune 50 company that is focusing on applying and developing a lot of AI algorithms and machine learning algorithms for large scale industrial problems. So my area at the moment is focused on supply chain in particular. So how do we optimize it? How can we use AI to augment and maybe even replace human decisions in complex systems like this, so that we can try to get to better decisions. We don't have these supply chain bottlenecks that are stopping everything. Those are not my algorithms. That's not my issue. Nothing to do with the chip shortage.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's really kind of what I'm focused on day to day. And so, on the to be a little bit more technical, use everything from linear programming, mixed integer programming, and optimization, which isn't really AI per se, but we combine that with a lot of deep reinforcement learning, which is the kind of stuff that you see coming out of AlphaGo and OpenAI and other big systems like that get a lot of the headlines.
Well, I maybe will hire you, because with my job dealing with supply chain issues all day long, and when's this container going to show up, and how many of this should I order? And I just feel like all my algorithms are not working for me some days. So anyway.
Christian, I was curious, how did you get involved in apologetics, and what work are you doing in that area now?
So my interest in apologetics started, about 10, 12 years ago, somewhere in that neighborhood. I was actually going to do my master's at ETH Zurich in Switzerland. It was just I was kind of preparing to go out there, and being in Europe and at these places, it tends to be much more secular, and ETH is considered like the MIT of Europe is what they call it. So it's a very technical school. It's you have a lot of people who are engineers, physicists. That's basically it that we have there. And so I was just kind of like, man, this is a different environment that I'm going to step in for my faith. Like, what is there out there that I can maybe learn about? Like, I knew that there were resources. I just didn't know anything about it. Right. And so the first thing I picked up was Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig. And I wound up just devouring that, found it incredibly fascinating. And that kind of just led from one thing to the next, where it's like, wow, I really love this area, because it opens up your mind to a lot of stuff that I just was not aware of, as far as, a lot of historical theology, study philosophy. You know, my background has always been in engineering and physics and computer science. And so like, that's kind of where I was at the time. I was focusing on those topics. And so, you know, philosophy was the farthest thing from my mind. It just wasn't relevant to my studies. It wasn't relevant to my life. And then when I found it, I was just like, wow, this really helps to complete my faith and bolster it in a way that I didn't know was possible. I didn't know was out there. So I wound up going down that path and that rabbit hole. And after I finished my master's there, I started working for a little bit, and then I decided to enroll to get a master's of apologetics at Biola. And so I wound up doing that while I was working full time. So I spread that out over a couple of years and picked up another master's in that degree.
Wow. Excellent. Brian obviously told me you work in the area of AI. I'm curious, what do you think in that field are some of the most common misconceptions, and how would you want to help people think more clearly about the subject of AI?
Yeah, I mean, there are a whole host of misconceptions. So I guess we can tackle it in a different, and, you know, try to narrow it down a little bit and maybe go through these. So I see some issues and misconceptions just around work and trying to use it like in a business environment, you know, where people think it's kind of magic fairy dust. Oh, we're doing AI. So yeah, it's going to solve all the problems. It doesn't work that way. You see other issues, and this comes out of a lot of futurists and prognosticators in Silicon Valley who essentially propagate these ideas around the singularity or artificial general intelligence, which is basically the idea that AI is going to be able to become human-like in its thought, and then, you know, because it's easy to update it and to change something in silicon, you know, whereas, you know, our evolutionary path takes much longer, a much faster time, longer time scale. AI can do it much faster, and so then it'll be able to improve itself over time and rapidly outpace us in intelligence, and then it will take over the world. And you have these different conceptions where it's going to be everything from catastrophic and world ending on one extreme to people who are saying, well, what are people going to do after that? Because now they're going to take all the jobs and everybody's going to be poor, except for, you know, some of the tech entrepreneurs who managed to actually control this stuff, and there's going to be huge stratification. And so you get this huge gamut of different outcomes with this kind of view. Yeah, there are a number of misconceptions that we can try to tackle along those lines and maybe get to some. So, you know, where do you want to start?
I would just want to say to listeners as well, just to remind them about Christian's podcast. Can you talk just briefly about what you cover in that podcast if people want to be like, hey, yeah, I like this area, let me dig deeper? Where would you point them and what will they find? Yeah,
so I actually haven't released a new episode in, since about mid-2020 or so. But there is over 100 some episodes up there that are available for download that talk about artificial intelligence. Really, we focused a lot on new cutting edge applications that were coming out of research and how they would impact how they'd impact people's lives, be it at work or, you know, day to day new tools that they could use. And yeah, we would cover a lot of these economic issues as well, you know, kind of these broader topics that we touch on. So you could find that at artificiallyintelligent.tech. So it's on all the podcatchers that you might have on iTunes, etc. But I haven't released anything new in quite a while, so don't look for any updates anytime soon.
So you mentioned, kind of narrowing that down, you mentioned the idea of AI becoming more human-like.
Right.
Talk about, and I'm fascinated and very curious about this, talk about how human-like do you think AI can become?
So I think it can be in certain narrow domains. So there has been, I don't know if you guys saw this or some of the listeners may have been aware that there's a company called OpenAI that released a system called GPT-3, which is a text producing our AI. So it basically it was trained on a massive corpus of articles and subreddits and, you know, other things online so that it would be able to generate a lot of human-like speech and text. And it's actually quite good with the stuff that it can do. So you can give it a prompt and you can get the outputs of it and see it generate, you know, like good sentences that are pretty easy to, you can read it and be like, well, somebody could have written this. And it's quite impressive. It really is. I had played around with the previous model, the second generation model, GPT-2, and did a lot of stuff with that. They kept GPT-3 under wraps a little bit more, only special access. So I never got that, unless at least last time I tried. But basically, it's just this huge, deep neural network. So a lot of these weights and biases and everything within this model that's been trained on this text to be able to produce it, and it can be very convincing. The issue though is that the results wind up being cherry picked quite often. So when you see the stuff come up in the articles that were heralding it, people typically type in 3, 4, 5 prompts because not everyone's great. There's a bit of randomness and stochasticity to it. And so some of the results that you get, it doesn't match up, or it quickly goes off the rails and it just kind of comes out to be a bit of gibberish. And then some of the other results wind up being fairly reasonable. And so you'll see a lot of people, they'll iterate through this, and a human will sit there in the loop and be able to read it and then, okay, choose the best. And so that's typically what gets presented. What winds up happening with this is that a lot of people will start to actually read this stuff and think like, wow, this is great, because they read it in the New York Times. I think they did a piece on it, or maybe it was the Atlantic, some major publication, but they did that human selection of the text that was coming out to really show how advanced this stuff is. But because there was that filter in between and it wasn't clear to most readers, people ran away with it like, oh, this is the most amazing thing ever. AI is here to take over our jobs or the world or whatever it is with producing this stuff. And it's not quite there. I think, at its core, these things are built on statistical models. So it winds up seeing that quite frequently there are these strings of words that will be related to one another in the training corpus that it gets. It will sample from some of the most probable different words that will be the next words to be able to actually string together these sentences and what have you. But there's no illusion there that it actually has any understanding of what it's doing. It's really just kind of guided by the math and by the stats underneath. So that's really where the current state of a lot of the AI sits, is it's based on statistics that are drawn from these large data sets that we have. And if anybody's interested, actually, I did a little experiment. I was going to play around with it a little bit more. I'll share the link if you guys want to check it out. But I had trained the GPT-2 model on a number of different self-help articles. I chose like thousands of self-help articles and books and other things like that. And I did some fine tuning on it to be able to produce some text that was out there, and actually write some articles and posted them to the blogging site Medium to play around with it and see how it was received. I only did a couple because there was a bit of editing that actually had to be take place to make it not so obvious that it was a bot. So there was that kind of filtering system. But I tried to leave as much of it untouched as possible and just maybe make the transition between different areas a little bit smoother. But I can share the link with you guys if you're interested in actually checking this out, and you can see a little bit of how it winds up making a lot of stuff up. It's a bit silly, especially when you know that it's a bot. You're like, oh, okay, this is you can sort of see, but it definitely has its limitations. It's a lot of really cool technology, but it's limited in that respect.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing I would add about it is that there have been a number of high profile cases where models developed by Google DeepMind or some of these other, or OpenAI, as I mentioned, beat some of the world's best in games. So you've got StarCraft 2, I think that was in 2019. You had a game called Dota 2 that OpenAI developed a system to beat the OpenAI 5. And they were able to beat teams of some of the best human players in these games. And so a lot of people will look at these kind of accomplishments, and they're big accomplishments. I mean, these are not easy games, to beat. And they're very complex. They're very fast paced. They have a massive search space to go through, and it's a competitive area. But people will look at this and try to extrapolate it and say, well, if AI was able to beat the world's best, people who live and breathe these games, play it 80 hours a week for years to get as good as they are at these video games, or AlphaGo, where they beat the 18-time world champion Lee Sedol in 2016 and Kejia the year later. They'll extrapolate and say, look at what AI is able to do in these areas. Therefore, it's only a matter of time before it's going to be able to do X, Y, or Z, and they'll say that it's going to basically outpace human development in these other areas. But there's a key misstep that a lot of people are making with this. And one is that, when people are interacting with the world, it's much broader than a game. These games are very narrowly prescribed. There's a clear objective to those games, so that can be codified as a reward function that these systems need. And basically a reward function is something that they need to measure how good their actions are, how good the system is actually performing. So in an example like, say, chess, if you win the game, maybe you get a reward of +1. If you lose it, maybe you get -1. And if it's a stalemate, then you get 0. And so it has something that's a very clear and unambiguous signal that it's able to optimize for. And so it can make those decisions and get that reward function and then make similar decisions in the future because it realizes that, okay, when I'm in this situation, doing this move is more likely to get me a reward than these other moves here. And that's how it winds up learning through feedback. There's nothing like that exists in the world. There's no objective function for your life. There's no reward function for your life or for different things that you're actually trying to do. It's much more difficult. It's much more ambiguous. And there isn't that kind of, that kind of data that's out there for you to be able to, train these systems, to be, better, however that might be defined, in these broad range of possibilities. They can work very well in these narrow systems where you have very clear goals that can be stated. And you can mathematize those goals and turn those into those reward functions and those objectives.
Do you think that issue that you just brought up there is overlooked sometimes by people who think that AI will eventually, some forms of AI can become eventually as conscious as, say, a human?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it's one of those situations that a lot of the prognosticators that you see aren't necessarily that aware of the limitations. They kind of just look at these big wins, and they also make this kind of materialist assumption that we're just basically meat machines as well. So if the human brain was able to become conscious through the process of evolution, then AI will figure out how to be conscious at some point just through its own sort of development over time. And, from a Christian perspective, obviously we push back on that. But I think there are a lot of other good reasons that you can, push for that kind of substance dualism type of approach and to try to understand that, okay, we are more than just our brains. We are more than just physical systems. And that's what these AI systems are and always will be.
Mm.
Yeah, that's a great point. That was something that I kind of realized when I looked into this a few years back, looking at the works of J.P. Moreland, some of the stuff he did on the soul. That was one of the conclusions I kind of drew is it's amazing how much worldview affects how you view this stuff, like how capable it is based upon what your worldview is. Yeah,
exactly. And that's where people kind of make that jump is they start with that materialistic assumption that we are just matter, nothing more. And so because the brain figured this out, then in principle, it's possible. And so it's just a matter of time before silicon figures it out.
Yeah.
Thinking about the different solutions that AI is best at, most geared to solving, what are the main areas where it's being pushed? And what do you think is progressing the fastest?
So there are a lot of cool applications that are coming out in areas of robotics that are pretty interesting to be able to see, using a lot of these similar techniques to be able to have better robotic control. MIT and Carnegie Mellon have been developing a lot of these systems that are incredibly impressive because you don't think about it too. It's if you let me be a nerd for just a second here, it's to be able to control some of these systems is an incredible feat when you think about your own body and just the balance that's required and all the feedback and everything that you need to go that gets wired to your brain to be able to keep balance while you're walking. And then there's a slight breeze that, might push you one way or the other. A lot of these classical systems that are set up for, these walking robots that you might see coming out of Boston Dynamics or what have you, they would fall over, right? Because they're not as robust to a lot of these things. But bringing a lot of these AI systems in, using these techniques like deep reinforcement learning has enabled it to be trained a lot more broadly so that it can be more reactive to some of these different situations and scenarios to be able to bring about more robust solutions. So, a lot of people are still hoping that self-driving cars will be just around the corner. kind of relying on a lot of this stuff. I mean, it's not going to be perfect, but using these techniques, there's a lot of cool stuff that can be built in, because previously you had to either have the precise dynamics modeled and have the equations for those set up, and that's very, very difficult to do, especially when you have something that's moving and you don't necessarily always know where the center of gravity is because things bend, and especially hard for and that's even a steel body. They bend and they twist, and so things aren't as rigid in reality as your little engineering 101 diagrams might show or might assume. And then when you get to soft bodies like ours, there's just an incredible amount of change. The fact that we're able to manipulate through move through with and keep our balance through all of that is just fascinating. And now we're starting to see that through AI impact robotics, which is, I think, one of the coolest areas to be able to see how these things are occurring. And everybody's going to say like, oh, Terminator, right? Now that the robots are walking and not getting kicked over as easily. But, it's still got a long ways to go before it's they're perfect systems, but they are making a lot of progress. One of the big areas that this stuff is coming through just because of the availability of data is AI applications, obviously in the text-based search, social media, et cetera. I think people, we've become so accustomed to Google, and just being able to type something into the search bar, and you're able to see exactly what you wanted and what you were looking for. I mean, there's an incredible amount of machine learning that goes on underneath, and when you actually think about it, the fact that you put a search in for Google for, say, apologetics, and you get over 1 billion different results. No, I have no idea what the actual number is, but maybe it's probably somewhere in that range. But you're able to actually see, because through their algorithms, through their machine learning that's tailored to you, stuff that's highly relevant to what you actually want when you just put apologetics in there, or you put whatever it might be, some recipe or what have you, something that's actually tailored to your tastes and your search history over time. I mean, and just to try this, go open up something like DuckDuckGo that doesn't track you, and it's very different experience. You don't necessarily see stuff that's as relevant to your searches, or as it takes more time to try to find it, because now you have to go to a couple of pages in or what have you, because it doesn't have that history and doesn't have that model that's built off of your preferences. So I sometimes sit back and think like, wow, that's actually an incredible technical marvel that it can sort through billions amounts of data, and it's been personalized to me. Now, there are downsides and there are issues to that, and everybody knows that how Google's been, changing search results and can manipulate things and suppress things and collect a massive amount of data on you. So there is a downside, but in a perfect world, it's amazing.
Well, can you explain, just for listeners and me, what's the difference between AI and machine learning, or is machine learning just one function under the umbrella of AI?
Yeah, so I would put it as that latter. So AI is a bit broader and can encompass other things, such as old forms of AI like expert systems, which were really just like massively long if-else statements that people would try to develop in the 80s and 90s to try to automate different processes. A lot of people don't necessarily refer to that kind of stuff as AI today, because everything's been taken over basically by machine learning. But, within the classical sense, there are a number of different, subdisciplines within AI that, so I tend to use them more or less interchangeably oftentimes. And that's typically what you see today. But AI typically winds up being a bit broader, encompassing more than just machine learning. But machine learning is really kind of the, makes up what 95% of people mean these days.
I used to say 10 years ago when I was running Apologetics 315, I always sort of smirked because I thought, oh, Apologetics 315 gets way more traffic because when you type in apologetics in Google, it offers you amongst the first suggestions 315. So I figured this is cool because people are going to find it inadvertently because it's going to offer it as an auto suggestion. Recently, I noticed that if I type it into Google, it doesn't do that. But if I go to over like Yahoo, it will do that. So It made me think, just what sort of, what does it take for someone just to say, well, let me just want to skew the results in favor of not letting certain voices be as prominent or easy to find. Like if I want to search for vaccine arguments one way or the other, because I'm like, oh, I would love to hear both sides, But if you type that in, you will not find it. It's like, I would love to hear the non-popular view, but you just can't find it looking for it. And it's like, I know they're out there, but they're not, you can't find it on Google. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how technologies are being used, what sort of maybe things that you've seen that would be concerning, and whether or not that relates at all to AI may be a different question. But what are your thoughts on that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I guess there are a couple different things that come to mind. So first off, I don't think anybody knows exactly how Google's search system works. Because it is incredibly complex, and they've been working on it for years, and they've kept it under wraps because that is their secret sauce. So anybody who's run a website knows about search engine optimization. That's typically aimed at Google. And so you always have people who are doing a lot of experiments to try to rank at the top of Google results, because there's a lot of money to be had if you are the first one that comes up when people type in, I don't know, investing or cars or, like whatever you're trying to rank for, because that's suddenly shown to a much larger population. And everybody knows that typically the best results are at the top. And so if you can get your, scammy website to be number one, you're probably going to get a lot more people who just trust you because of that. So I don't think anybody's really knows exactly how every bit of Google's search works, because it's been decades in development. It's very complex. There's a lot of stuff that goes in and that happens in the background. And it's going to be different than how Yahoo's works or how DuckDuckGo's works or how Yandex or Baidu or others. They have their own ways of kind of providing search and providing that information that you're looking for. Now, with all that, being said, so there could be reasons for a difference that you would see, not seeing 315 be auto completed on Google. You might have different people searching on Google than you do on Yahoo or on other things as well. So they might have different results that wind up being ranked. Just kind of hypothesizing about why some of those differences could occur and not necessarily be nefarious. Now, like with all that, it does seem to be the case though that there is a lot of stuff that does get suppressed. Especially with Google, and you saw recently one of the companies that they own, YouTube, get rid of dislike buttons, and there's been a lot of speculation about that and the reason for that, because a lot of politically favorable individuals and people and organizations were getting completely ratioed with the dislikes, where it was like 10-1 dislike to like, and so they wound up getting rid of that under the umbrella of fighting misinformation and what have you. So whether that's a good thing or whether they were fighting misinformation or not, it does seem that it does feel as if somebody's putting their thumb on the scale with a lot of those. And personally, I see that as being something that's rather dangerous, especially for a free society. If you start to control information flows, if you start censoring ideas because they're not popular or because you deem them to be dangerous, it's a technocratic control that you're basically ceding to a lot of these companies when they start to be activists in this kind of way. I know that there are people who have completely justified reasons in their minds for doing a lot of this stuff, because they don't necessarily want certain things to be out there. And there are some things that, we would agree with them doing. So you could imagine pornographic sites or whatever that could be ranking very high for very benign terms that could be searched for, and you would want them to maybe intervene to keep those down. And you don't necessarily want kids or other people to just stumble across that. So you can imagine those types of scenarios, and they're just taking that kind of reasoning and now applying it to a lot of other areas where it might not be as clear cut for most of the population. And I think that's it's hard to know where that line is, and where you would want to have somebody kind of, as I said, put their thumb on the scale to tip things or to bury things or to hide things or to not show it to people. But it does feel to me as if they've gone over that line.
Okay, so last time we talked, I asked you if Skynet was going to take over the world. But so I just wanted to get your take on something else. Elon Musk suggests that, we could be living in a computer simulation. So, it's more likely than not. Maybe you've heard this, and I wanted to get your take on it. I wanted to get your quick response to whether or not we're living in a computer simulation, and maybe give our listeners a background what exactly you're talking about.
Yeah, well, I think that we're definitely not in a computer simulation. So this was a argument that was put forward, I think, in the early 2000s, at least first I saw it was from Nick Bostrom from a paper around 2002, 2003, somewhere around there. And he's a professor of philosophy at Oxford, originally from Sweden, and he wrote a very influential book on artificial intelligence. The name is escaping me at the moment. First page of it is basically making that materialist assumption we discussed earlier, and then all the terrible things that can happen from AI once you go down that path. And there are a number of other questionable assumptions through there. So I didn't buy his thesis, but he made this argument that basically we're either in base reality, as they put it, which is essentially the real world, or not in a simulation. We're in the world that can create the simulations, or we're in a simulation. And because of that materialistic assumption that basically all things can be boiled down to silicon at some point, or whatever kind of materials that you might have available to you, that you could in fact simulate another universe perfectly like this with conscious creatures. Right. So if we simply are matter and material objects and nothing else to us, then you could in principle simulate other conscious beings and get those running in a computer program. So if that's the case, then what he argues is that it's probable that that has been discovered at some point by someone else in the universe, and so then there are probably multiple simulations that have been running throughout the universe. So what if there are many different simulations out there? Then it's not very probable that we're actually in base reality, in terms of the argument. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's kind of like the Boltzmann brain hypothesis, sort of like in the technological sense.
Yeah, so the Boltzmann brain being like the most probable observer of a universe is basically a brain that would an observer that would come out of the various fluctuations and be able to observe the universe and then return, and seeing that we are seeing a very orderly area of the universe. It's not infinitely old. We aren't just a fluctuation that's come into being, etc. Because we're seeing a very large space of the universe, so it's not infinitely old. That kind of argument from the Boltzmann brain. Yeah, it's similar. So basically, if you have a million different universes that are out there, 999,000 of them are simulated and one isn't, then just by luck of the draw, we're more likely in a simulated universe than not. That's where he's got it going.
Would you agree, or would it be fair to say that this idea that we're in a computer simulation is kind of a backhanded compliment to the fine tuning and the overall design of the universe? Because it's an explanation that obviously most people, I think, to do science, you have to have the presupposition that the universe is orderly and that reason is, you can trust your reason. Is it that, well, we're clearly living in something that looks designed, so how can we explain that? Well, one way to do that is a computer simulation. That's
an interesting way to put it. And I actually haven't come across anybody offering that rebuttal. To be fair, I haven't done a whole lot of research on this argument. I've read the original paper and maybe one or two responses, but I think that's a good way to counter someone. To look at it and say, okay, well, clearly there's some intelligence that's going around here, and that's one way to put it. It's not just chaos here in this in our little simulation, if somebody wants to say that. So there is a creator and a designer of this at some point. So, where is that designer? And I guess you could probably even take that all the way back, and still, if they still want to hold that we're, in a simulation, be like, well, there's still a God out there. You just got to go back a couple levels. But, but to be fair, I haven't heard anybody who really puts their stakes their claim in the fact that we're in a simulation. But it has become popular because Musk has quite a following, and he gave a talk where he threw the idea out there a couple of years ago.
It comes back to the idea of worldview as well, and perfect illustration of how your starting assumption colors where you're going with things. With that in mind, is there much work being done in the ethics of what they're doing with artificial intelligence? Because, to my mind, I'm thinking that, when you were mentioning stuff like winning games, these are military games in essence, World of Warcraft or something like that. Why not win a war against your enemies in the real world by using AI tactically I'm sure there's some place in some government somewhere where these guys are working on that, let's just train the drones to, do whatever. So what sort of maybe ethical issues are being talked about? Would you happen to come across that sort of a thing?
Yeah, so there was a book that came out a couple months ago. It was authored by Eric Schmidt, who's the former CEO of Google, and Henry Kissinger, actually. And so they discussed a lot of this. And so the issues around artificial intelligence, particularly within weapon systems. And a lot of the book talked about how, this technology is going to really change that geopolitical landscape, looking at different nations and how they might approach this technology, and kind of calling for more work to be done in the area of AI weapon and weapons. Like what does it mean if there's a system that's autonomous and that does a drone strike or what have you? And they really tried to frame everything in within discussing it within the context of the nuclear proliferation and sort of that Cold War mindset, whereby you have a lot of people thinking very deeply about what does it mean to use a nuclear weapon and relating that to AI. If you have something like mutually assured destruction, what are the ethical implications of killing innocent civilians with these kinds of weapons, of what kind of damage can be done, and how do we try to take some of the lessons that we learned in some of those frameworks and apply those to artificial intelligence. So that's one area where I've seen AI being discussed. There was a paper a couple of years ago, I'm not going to remember the details of it, but discussing particularly with autonomous drones and where they might fit in on the battlefield. Unfortunately, I don't think that there's a whole lot of people discussing some of those areas, at least maybe not enough in ethical uses like that. A lot of the ethics stuff that's coming out is really around equity that you'll see in many of the papers. So they talk about, again, coming back to Google putting their thumb on the scale with search results, showing different results or trying to be more fair to marginalized communities with other things that are coming out of these AI systems and these recommender systems. So there was an article that was published a few years ago that looked at some of these machine learning systems that have been trained on recidivism rates. So you'll have some systems that are used to help judges make decisions based on sentencing guidelines. And so they'll put in the demographics and some facts of the case and what have you, and out will come, sentencing suggestions, more or less, for judges and courts to be able to use. And what they found was that these wound up being very skewed towards Black and Hispanic people within the U.S. So to get much harsher rates than people who were white, even though race was not an input. Because it's correlated with locations and socioeconomic levels and a bunch of other things. So there's been a lot more ethics focus on a lot of these systems, at least from what I've seen, rather than kind of on the bigger, grander scale.
Interesting. Another ethical element that I think you alluded to earlier, or either maybe that pre-show, but the concern of people's jobs being taken away and things like that. Would that be another concern, or how much in the forefront would that be?
Yeah, if you ask me, I don't think it's much of a concern at all. Like, I'm much more concerned about the state using AI in these cases for areas of war, or even in these sentencing cases, and completely locking up people for a lot of these things. I think that's much more of a concern than the job issue per se, because the way that technology runs is that as systems come online and new technologies and new machines are developed and then implemented in industrial processes and whatnot, is that people get wealthier overall. These are labor-saving devices. If they can help us make better decisions, if they can help us be more productive with less inputs and more efficient with our time, and that's great. Because what is wealth? Wealth isn't really the amount of money that you have, but it's the amount of stuff that you can get. It's having a house, it's having food, it's having vehicles, transportation, all this stuff. That's really what wealth is, not just the dollars in your pocket or in your bank account. And so by improving a lot of that efficiency, it makes your purchasing power increase. So that's why you're able to see a lot of those people rise up out of poverty and have higher standards of living in industrialized countries versus non-industrialized countries. It's not just that there are more dollars floating around, it's that there's actually more stuff that they have available to purchase. And that's what that capital production winds up leading to. And so a lot of the people who are saying that, AI is going to take our jobs, it's going to leave everybody and throw them out on the street, guys like Andrew Yang, who ran for president the last cycle. Yeah, they make a lot of these cases. They make a very basic assumption that's flawed, called the lump of labor fallacy. That basically that there's only a fixed amount of work to be done in an economy or a society at any given time, and that if any sort of machine or anything that might automate that or take that away from a person is therefore going to be somebody without a job or without work, and so they aren't going to be valuable to society. They aren't going to be able to do something else because that's done for. And clearly, that's not what we see from a historical perspective. These machines that will come along, the classic examples like the weavers and the looms and all the other stuff in the Industrial Revolution that gave rise to the Luddites, where we still have that term where they would go around and smashing the looms to be able to, say like, hey, we want to keep our jobs. It winds up causing, what these systems wind up doing is they wind up causing disruptions for some people in the short term. So maybe you do lose your job, but you can move into some other position. And it might be painful for some people who get displaced because they have to pick up new skills or they have to change jobs, maybe even relocate in some cases. And, not to belittle anything like that, but overall, that's how society advances. And even in the case of the Luddites and the looms, you wound up having more people that were employed in textile manufacturing after the advent of these automatic looms, where they didn't have to, do everything by hand. And the reason being because the price dropped, because now you had more that you could make more efficiently. And so as the price dropped, demand increased. Because now people wanted to buy it, because now you could have 2 coats instead of just one. Oh, that's exciting. And now you can have different colors, and now you can have other things because it becomes more affordable to you because overall productivity increased. And that's what technology winds up doing to the economy. And that's why, I'm not concerned about these calls of mass unemployment due to artificial intelligence and due to automation. It's just a different kind where we can now start to automate a lot of our decision making, or certain types of decision making. But what you also wind up seeing is that people get to be moved into more. They can either trade that off with more free time. We've got shorter work weeks and shorter work hours because more things are automated, or you can move into, the kind of higher value added areas of work that tends to be more creative, where you wind up setting more of the strategic direction, because that's areas that AI and these machines aren't able to work in.
So you're talking there a lot there, Christian, about technology and the benefits and things. And then you're going to, with any sort of technology, you're going to say, well, here's the plus side and here's the downside. I wonder what your perspective is as a Christian who's thoughtful about the issues, especially working in this area of technology. The question relates to technology in general. And is there, if you will, a Christian approach to technologies? Contributing to that question is my thoughts on like how dependent we can be on things and distracted we can be with entertainment and manipulated by news feeds and that sort of a thing. So do you think there's a certain Christian principles that would help inform us whatever technology we're looking at?
Prayer. Yeah.
Yeah.
In all honesty, so we're recording this in 2022, right? And so for people who are listening in the future, this is still, it feels like, I guess, the tail end of the COVID-19 hysteria and everything that's been going on over the past couple of years. But, we'll see if it's actually the tail end or not.
Right.
But there have been a lot of people, and myself included, I've been affected by this, about seeing a lot of the news, one way or the other, about either loss of freedoms or deaths or people who have been scared. We're at an all-time high with a lot of suicides, mental illness, and other issues because people have been socially isolated over this time period. People have lost their jobs. People have been separated from families. There's been a lot of fear and uncertainty that's come through this, and a lot of this information comes through those devices that we have, from being on Twitter and from being on Facebook or whatever it is that you might be attached to or consuming a lot of this information or keeping in touch with people from. And so just even thinking about how a lot of that has affected me and my family, it's one of those things where I always need to go back to God with a lot of these issues and say, like, okay, I'm feeling anxiety because of this and this and this, and because I've been inundated with a lot of these things. And we didn't touch on this, but with the social media and, kind of what a lot of people wind up optimizing for, be it Google or Facebook or whatever, is attention and people's clicks and getting people to engage with this content. And what we find is that stuff that makes people anxious, stuff that is a bit hyperbolic, the world is coming to an end, winds up doing well. And that's just something in the human psyche that people want to see that stuff. And now we have devices that are presenting it to us. And it is driven by a lot of this machine learning and getting that feedback where it says, hey, somebody else clicked on this, we'll adjust the weights a little bit more to show it some more, because that fits into our objective function of that metric of trying to optimize for that user engagement. So we have these systems that do so, and it's very easy to get sucked into it and not prayerfully consider what it is that you're reading, and not go back to the fact that, we have a God who is sovereign, a God who has organized a lot of the world and history and set it in motion to his glory and to his ends. And we might go through times where there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of anxiety and frustration and pain, but we have to rely on him on a regular basis. And so, just even with these technologies that we've been talking about today, I think ultimately that's where we have to find our grounding, find our being, and find our peace. Because without that, we're just going to be cast to the winds, because we do have a lot of these forces. And, like I said, it's our own hardwiring in some cases where we want to see that kind of stuff. We're drawn to it. We want to see the latest train wreck that's occurring for whatever reason. That's just kind of the way we are. And so we have to find ways and develop strategies to deal with that. And I think one of the best is just to prayerfully consider how you're actually using this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Amen. Well said.
Well, thank you for your thoughts on that and the spiritual side of things. And for, the optimizing side of things, I think I'll entitle this episode, Why AI is Going to Kill You, and it should get plenty of listens.
So there you go. Yeah. And now you'll be contributing to this as well. So.
I'm doing it for Jesus. Well, Christian, thanks so much for joining us for the interview. I hope to be in touch in the future.
Likewise.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Otten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.
You never want to put all your eggs in one basket. But what if that basket is really, really big? With Acme For You, you get a huge basket, big enough for personalized deals on things you like to buy and even a free treat on your birthday. You can earn rewards on nearly all purchases and redeem them for things like free groceries and discounts on gas. So go ahead and put all your eggs in one basket. Become a free Acme For You member today. No purchase necessary. Download the Acme Deals and Delivery app and feed your joy. Visit acmemarkets.com/foryou for program details.
Finding the right person for the job isn't easy. Just ask someone who hired a lounge singer to be their office receptionist.
Hello, this is Mickey Marquis, and you've reached the office of Doug & Associates. Thank you very much. Catch me Tuesday nights at the Hotel Johnson. Hello?
But if you've got an insurance question, you can always count on your local Geico agent. They can bundle your policies, which could save you hundreds.
Doug and Associates, this is Mickey Market. Hello?
For expert help with all your insurance needs, visit geico.com/local today.